Sorry, I thought Grace and Panache were going to be my backup singers, so I was taken off guard by that. Thank you, Dr. Gates. The period of American film that spans from the beginning of the 20th century through the 1960s is generally thought of as being one of bowing, scraping, and shuffling, shoulders down, chin up, and white teeth flashed as a sign of obedience. But I've always found it hard to look at some actor like poor Montan Moreland or Willie Best, actors who made a profession of being rattled, scared. When you look to play poker with either one of these guys, they give it to you as soon as you see them. I find it hard to look at these guys and not see what's supposed to be a simpering smile, as much as it seemed to me to be a saturnine grin. One of the biggest, I think, tragic figures in the history of 20th century popular culture is Sammy Davis Jr. And I could never look at him and not see at least a glimmer of fury in what was supposed to be strictly presentational artificiality. Poor Sammy. You get the feeling he was so concerned about what image he was supposed to project that he dressed for dinner in order to go to the bathroom in his own house. Subsumed by anger, the display of hostility vented itself for such performers, guys like Sammy Davis Jr., Willie Best, and Montan Moreland, in the outlay of energy. They were out to electrocute an audience into submission. Denied the opportunity to show any ease whatsoever, or even a functioning sense of irony about their own work, they treated each appearance as another beginning, each round of applause with laughter. The very approbation audiences give to signal welcome was never the salve they required to soothe their wounded souls. Think about Sammy, from Rufus T. Jones for President, his first filmed appearance when he's a little boy wearing tap shoes that seemed to weigh more than he did, to Ocean's 11, in which he had to smile through the indignity of pulling overalls over his handmade silk suits so he could play a garbage man, and be unable to show even the working man's pride in doing his job. Joey Bishop got to show more class than Sammy Davis Jr. What emphasized Davis's plight was that proto-Goodfellas calm that the other Rat Packers exemplified. For Davis, there was never a single moment when he got to lower his blood pressure. And what black person could not identify the plight of a brother who looked like he had to will his way through the valley of hypertension? All this was in the effort of providing entertainment. These performers on film were sacrificing themselves before what even the most enlightened audiences thought of as being the altar of triviality. What made these men and women so intriguing was that what they did might be considered by some to be preening, journeyman-like demonstrations of pride and craft. On further thought, maybe even what Kierkegaard called purity of heart, the ability to will a single thing into being. And for all of them in these pre-1970s films, that purity would have consisted of acceptance. For me, these entertainers of the years before the 1960s became archetypes more potent than the tragic mulatto, and similar, because they were never offered safe conduct into either camp. In the abstract, such a pursuit sounds preposterous, lowering yourself into the well of absurdity and hoping that no one would notice that you were soaking wet with sweat, shame, and perhaps a hint of fear. Fear that all the anger that you sent across the soundstage might be picked up by one prospective audience member, the mainstream, who would bother to examine what it was you were doing a little more closely than anyone else. Again, we get back to what we talked about yesterday, to Ralph Ellison. These performers, these actors before the 1960s slaved away in those basements while the blues called their name, until they stepped before the cameras to remind America that it had no reason to be frightened of African Americans. But instead of stealing away all the juice from monopolated power and light, these performers generated their own wattage, sheer, undiluted anger, and a ferocity to keep it all hidden away, the show business equivalent of some kind of cloaking device from Star Trek, because these performers didn't want to be exposed in what was essentially the undiscovered country, the projects of unspoken fury that all black entertainers were confined to, the land they constantly had to navigate their ways back to and forth from without detection. For all the unmitigated star power in a movie like, say, Stormy Monday, and this was a Catholic feature, Lena Horne at the peak of her cafe con leche sexuality, as well as Bill Bojangles Robinson, Fats Waller, Coleman Hawkins, and Cab Calloway. In the end, in that movie, nothing really catches fire. Louis Armstrong, when he turned of his movies, for all the magnanimous control and exercise of talent that he fired up on his recordings, when you saw him in a movie, something like The Five Pennies, he always stood in the very margins of the frame, the first thing to be ostensibly cropped out when these movies were panned and scanned for television. He was expendable. Amazingly enough, though, all these actors and actresses who labored so diligently to accomplish rendering themselves non-threatening, all the while were expending enough BTUs to start a riot large enough to engulf the entire eastern seaboard. They nearly killed themselves to remain incognito, all the while slaying movie house audiences. The biggest example of one of these wolves in sheep's clothing was Bill Bojangles Robinson. There's a new movie now starring Jackie Chan called Tuxedo, in which he plays a hapless coward whose bionic evening wear does his fighting for him. Chan's comic takes have always been about his own astonishment, while everything below his neck has a mind of its own. In a way, he's always been in a tuxedo. And it's axiomatic in the way that Jackie Chan plays physical comedy that his jaw always seems to be dropping while his limbs slap down whichever pack of stunt thugs happen to be standing in his path. His body always seemed to have a mind of his own. After being touted as the next logical inheritor to Bruce Lee, who's been called the Gene Kelly of martial arts, in the 1960s and 70s, Jackie Chan was unable to generate any audience appeal. It seemed that no one wanted to see another Fist of Fury superstar with a straight, stoic face. So Chan chose to go in a wholly different direction. He invented the genre that could best be described as martial arts slapstick. He was a coward who had to be pushed into a fight, and his pratfalls accomplished as much in defeating his foes as encountering them mano a mano. Instead of using the rope-a-dope, he was the action hero as dope. He's never been accused of tomming, though, using a simpering act to pander to audiences. And I've often thought that Jackie Chan is a modern corollary to Bill Bojangles Robinson. Let's look at it like this. Jackie Chan was packed off by his parents at the age of 9 to the Peking Opera, whose intense and torturous regimen of physical training would make Charles Dickens think twice about his concept of institutional punishment of orphans. Chan trained primarily as a dancer, but as a kid, he basically had stabs broken across his back. Ritual humiliation is motive. For Bill Bojangles Robinson, his ritual humiliation came in a different way, from continually having to carve an innocuous crow-eating smile, a Jim Crow-eating smile, in fact, into his face, and letting his shoulders slump into the most docile posture possible. Robinson had to make himself look as though he were almost asleep standing up. Now just try that. You see how difficult a task that is, being basically supine on your feet. Now imagine holding that pose for hours at a time, restraining all the erect strands that having a dancer's physicality enforces on your body. You get just a small taste of a minute understanding of what it was like for Bill Bojangles Robinson to endure what he had to in every movie he suffered through. This was not a choice for him between silk or satin. It was asking if you wanted to be beaten with a baseball bat or a bamboo rod. And it encapsulates the anger that black performers of that day felt, the rage that shoved them in front of the cameras, that served as a kind of real pride, but a kind of anger that made them say, pay attention to me, I'm going to win your attention by any means possible. It wasn't merely a matter of pride for them. This anger became the show business version. It functioned for them in the same way that spirituals did for slaves, using what appeared to be a sweet, clamoring form of expression to communicate something entirely different, a kind of subversion, if you will, a black code. What performers like Bojangles did essentially was turn this subversion into a physical act, and the undercurrent of drama in each movement was mesmerizing to me. When I was a kid, and all my friends shook with disgust when watching Shirley Temple movies, I was hypnotized by them. To me, it looked like Bojangles wanted to kill that little girl with his feet. She would tap out a couple of beats, and he'd slyly pound out a flourish. It was like watching Jackie Chan. His face and body sent out wholly contradictory messages. His hips and face and strong knees told me he wanted to crush his child, and all she represented into the ground was the deftest form of defiance available, unspoken communication. And that level of animosity that was put forth was something I caught on the small screen of a black and white TV with bad reception. The first time I saw one of these Robinson Temple dance sequences projected onto a large screen in 35 millimeter, it was like watching Grendel try to show some affection towards Beowulf. An insane inflation of an anger that took on mythic proportions. I had to wonder what brand of self-delusion Darryl F. Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, who made these Shirley Temple movies, was living under. If whatever drug he was taking was available today, there'd certainly be a lot fewer anxiety sufferers walking the streets. Bill Bojangles Robinson, he was the dancer as prisoner. He wasn't allowed to express the kind of fluid cool that Fred Astaire, who said that Robinson was the best dancer he ever saw, exert. Robinson even paid tribute to Astaire even paid tribute to Robinson with a dance number, a Bojangles bit in the musical Swing Time. But Astaire's boneless grace, he often to me suggests a man born without joints in his body, was the polar opposite of Robinson's rhythmic attack. He was the dancer's percussionist, and each volley of his shoes, these wooden-toed shoes, each volley he fired off kept time. He was the Art Blakey of tap, right down to the snarling volatility, and was not assuaged by Astaire's compliment of imitation. Off-screen, Robinson was a man who lived to fight. He would not apologize to Shirley Temple had he seen her on the street. He was an unrepentant tangle of anger who kept his left hand plunged deep into his pockets of his custom-made pants, fingering the straight razor that was always at the ready for any kind of insult, perceived or actual. He brooked no thumbprint on his immaculately assembled personage off-screen. The contrast between watching him in a real movie, something like, well, a Harlem in Heaven or Stormy Monday, as compared to The Little Colonel with Dimples, in which he had to bank his flame and not upstage a child, essentially a felony for a black man in the 1930s. There's no better prism into the anger that kept African-American performers going than him. You can conceive of being an African-American in a world in which the gold standard, the highest achievement of the art in which you attempt to apply your trade, were movies such as Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation, then you have some sense of the rage that kept the nerves of African-American performers tingling. Think back to the young Dorothy Dandridge. Her first appearance was as one of the smiling faces in the sea of black servility, backing Harpo Marx in the loathsome All Got Still and Got Rhythm number in The Day at the Races. If you're Dorothy Dandridge, where do you go from there? Every day is an effort to fight gravity, and for black performers of her day, it must have felt like living on Jupiter, where the gravitational pull is twice that of what it is on Earth. To be treated like a pet while before the cameras, and then have every man on the set try to paw you, feel his wet, grasping breath on the back of your neck, as he acknowledged being helpless before your beauty when the cameras weren't running, when such compliments didn't matter, well, that's a prison too. As hard as Halle Berry worked in the biopic Dorothy Dandridge, what she couldn't suggest is that with all her surreal good looks, this quality that Dorothy Dandridge had, and even though Dorothy Dandridge was herself beautiful, she looked like a statue carved out of white chocolate, Dandridge also looked slightly more worn each time she appeared before the screen. By the time of Porgy and Bess, she'd been in over 30 pictures, including less than happy work such as Drums of the Jungle and Tarzan's Peril, until Porgy and Bess. That she managed to do so without looking totally used up by 1955 is wholly born of the slowly burning fuse of appropriate anger that she brought to play in the femme fatale role she finally got. When she first got the chance to act, to be an adult woman, opposite Harry Belafonte in Bright Road in 1953, she was nearly shuddering with relief, and belief in her own self. She was womanly and genuinely, unashamedly vivacious, and Belafonte reacted with every fiber of his being. His intensity, bless him, he wasn't built for subtlety in those days. He hadn't yet learned to use the music in his voice and let that do the work for him. His intensity was mitigated by her heavenly patience. She'd seemed infinitely tolerant of a man whose acting style suggested a highly tuned car idling at the Indy 500, because it was her time to shine and she was ready for it. As a result, the chemistry was riveting. So when she finally got Carmen Jones a chance to flaunt her superiority to mortal men, even to Harry Belafonte, with whom she was reunited in Carmen, she was poised for a breakthrough. She was the first African-American woman to be nominated for the Best Actress Oscar, and her competition in that year, in 1954, was huge. They were women who had given career-defining classic performances. The other nominees included Judy Garland in The Star is Born, Audrey Hepburn in Sabrina, Grace Kelly in The Country Girl, I feel like I'm about to open the envelope here, and Jane Wyman in Magnificent Obsession. These are all great performances, every one, but Dorothy Dandridge's work in Carmen Jones stands the test of time as well. Absolutely. Now, that there can be and should be no question. She lost to Grace Kelly. And oddly enough, Dorothy Dandridge's career never really recovered from, of all things, losing the Oscar. It was a breakthrough to real movie stardom. We have to wonder, though, and ask ourselves this question. Would things have been worse for her had she won? Where would there have been for her to go in 1954? It was probably swallowed anger that cost Dandridge her life. She had to absorb it, to just choke on it, to keep it back because she never got a chance to exhibit what she had to offer as a grown woman, as an adult human being with real adult sexuality ever again. And her career forces us to ask a question. How big is the line between disgust and self-hatred, between anger and self-loathing? Because that self-directed disgust, a form of anger in and of itself, can be a kind of fuel. It undoubtedly powered the career of Dandridge, certainly, but even Mantan Moreland, whose feats don't fail me now, was finally rescued from a joke and used for irony by George Clinton in Parliament Funkadelic. Moreland's high-octane performances almost seem like something out of a Stephen King novel. He stared into the camera as if he wanted to make it burst into flame, exploding the device as it recorded his stunted, childish antics he no doubt would have been afraid would be recorded for posterity forever and ever. And unfortunately, they have. I'm not sure how any other actor in a shot with him coped with his feverish signifying, but in the movies, such as the Charlie Chan pictures, his overacting seemed to be almost contagious. It seemed that this kind of implicit expression of anger became a kind of underground poetry. Underground, because no black person I knew of when I was growing up who saw these movies did not notice it. And it rolled off the noses of many of the mainstream audience members like Rain. And by mainstream audiences, I mean the opposite of what demographic surveyors call urban audiences. Actually, the whole phenomenon was akin to what Bill Withers summarized as pouring muddy water on me and trying to convince me that it's rain. I never bought it for a second. But the subterfuge succeeded for a very long time. The first time I ever really noticed how much black anger was being held in check was seeing what must have been the weirdest bad movie in the history of motion pictures. The film adaptation of the well-meaning crock, Black Like Me. Now, maybe in print, this liberal fantasia could get away with the strains it placed on credulity. If you don't know the story, it's an autobiographical book about a white man who injects himself with something, and not heroin or LSD, so he can look black and experience racism firsthand. And it's reported that the author, John Howard Griffin, later died, and not of embarrassment, but rather the side effects, whatever it took to darken his skin. Now, in the film Black Like Me, which I saw at a drive-in with my family, it got more laughs than any movie I've ever seen in my entire life. And now I've seen Showgirls and Battlefield Earth in movie theaters packed with audiences, just to give you a sense of the scale. The whole enterprise, Black Like Me, was like some adult American version of Ionesco or Beckett staged with a cast of sock puppets. It was totally unbelievable. James Whitmore played the lead, and he wandered through the South with something spit on his face that made him look more like he just changed the oil in his car and forgotten to wipe his face, then looked like a black man. But there it was, every redneck in Black Like Me who'd soon be auditioning for Deliverance, in this goofy social melodrama about reverse passing, giving Whitmore a hard time for being a nigger. That the cast managed to keep a straight face to this day still astounds me. And in each encounter, Every time a redneck saw him, they snarled the word and added an extra syllable, enunciating it as if they learned to pronounce the word phonetically. It was like every white person in black like me was a member of some racist version of ABBA, singing in a language they'd never bothered to master. But the anger in the faces of the African-American cast members of Black Like Me, and these actors included Roscoe Lee Brown, Al Freeman Jr., Richard Ward, and Billy Allen, the anger in their faces was unavoidable. They tried to keep it in check, but it was undeniably there. And whenever there's a scene with Whitmore and a black actor, the jeering and the laughing, the name-calling in the audience automatically stopped. The audience members were as cosmically pissed off as any member of the cast. No doubt these cast members dealing with the fact that for them, the movie industry had ended in the 1960s. The fact was that the stereotypical roles for black actors were drying up because of the justifiable and vocal civil rights protests over the shucking and jiving that African Americans used to have to grin and bear. Flotsam, that was all that was left for them to cling to in those days. Things were totally different now. There was no flotsam. The oceans were empty. What kind of brave new world was this? This was a particularly piquant dilemma that African American actors found themselves trapped in. They had closed one door finally. They had finally rejected the yoke of the grinding, horrible, one-dimensional stuff that would keep Sammy Davis Jr. spiritually hobbled forever, that left Butterfly McQueen confined to the scrap heap, that finally retired Stephen Fetchit and Montana Mullins in the roles that made them and us all wince whenever we passed by them when changing the channels. Movie work disappeared in the 1960s. That anger was left afloat freeform. Actors tried to get stage work. In New York was the beginning of the Negro Ensemble Company, which gave vent to a very specifically spoken anger. But in the movies, there was no such place. Movie work was gone. And with the startling exception in the 1960s, there were a few remaining Tarzan movies, which eventually made the move to the last graveyard, television, where someone's idea of enlightenment was to cast Dinah Ross and the Supremes as nuns doing missionary work in an episode of Tarzan. There wasn't much work left for black actors to get. In the 1960s, black action movies and the demi-renaissance the movement would create for black actors was probably what felt like eons away. It was in 1965, when things were so bleak, that the Laurence Olivier Othello, the art house version of Black Like Me, was treated as a revelation. And the condescension on black actors was such that even Pauline Kael wrote about this Olivier performance. And I talked to her about this, and she was still embarrassed by it. She wrote in 1965 of Olivier in Othello, "What Negro actor at this stage in the world's history could dare bring to the role the effrontery that Olivier does? And which Negro actor could give this reading? I saw Paul Robeson, and he was not as black as Olivier is." Now that's true. Paul Robeson was not black as Olivier was, but Paul Robeson couldn't get real work. It was amazing. Black actors in the 1960s couldn't get work as Othello. They had to subsist on whatever work they could find. Wait, basically until 1969, when a major motion picture studio, for the first time, hired an African-American director to direct a movie. That was Gordon Parks, who wrote and directed the adaptation of his Bildungsroman, The Learning Tree. And if you'd been young enough to play a 13-year-old protagonist, they'd have made him do that too, probably. In those sad days of underemployment, two black actors steadily got work. Woody Strode, because he was apparently the only black man who could ride a horse. So he got called whenever there was a Western to be made. And since he apparently couldn't ride a horse, all the other jobs went to Sidney Poitier. It wasn't until I worked on the American Film Institute tribute to Sidney Poitier in 1992, and I was surrounded by Louis Gossett Jr. and Ivan Dixon and Morgan Freeman, that it finally occurred to me, these men were all contemporaries of Sidney Poitier. When I made the joke that they must have hoped Poitier would catch cold so they could get work, Morgan Freeman just shook his head and said, no, those movies would have been canceled because they wouldn't have been made without anybody besides Poitier. These are the actors who would have had the self-possession and the verve in 1965 to give Othello the kind of dancing complexity and swooping paranoia that Shakespeare wrote about. And that very anger these actors sublimated until the 1970s, when they finally were allowed the opportunity to let their voices fly. This anger can still be found in Morgan Freeman, incidentally. Here's an actor who, in his physical prime in the 1970s, made vowels and consonants into a musical game on the Electric Company as Easy Reader. He has not gone gentle into that good night, though. At 65, at a time when most working people think about retirement, Morgan Freeman has kept all of his gorgeous flights of anger alive, masterful in his employment of it, still ministering to his craft and working to make for all the years he couldn't get work at the one thing he was best at. He was no doubt choking, as many black actors of his generation have told me they have, when they read of the reception that Olivier garnered for his Coon Act in 1965 as Othello. In 1965, no black actor would ever have been considered serious enough to play Othello. And at that point, Olivier was merely starring in the film version of the stage production that took the world by storm. It was basically 1995 when a black actor, Laurence Olivier, was invited to play Othello in a film version on screen. A few others had done it in movies that were barely released. William Marshall, stepping away from Blackula for a few days, and of all people, Ted Lang. That's right, Isaac, your bartender from The Love Boat, also played Othello. It was a project, though, that he nurtured for years. He tried to get going before he got started on The Love Boat and basically wanted to use it as a way to finance the picture, which he did. It was a sign of his anger, his hatred, that he had to carry this role around in his back pocket and he pointed at the screen and smiled, tomming it up as Isaac on The Love Boat, turning all his years of work training as a serious actor into one joke. As recently as 1981, Jonathan Miller's version of Othello starred Anthony Hopkins as the Moor of Venice, something that must reduce many black actors into downing gallons of a nice Chianti, since they've never considered for this role. But we have to wonder, too, if the reaction of black audiences might have gotten in the way of black actors playing Othello. I went to see Waiting to Exhale when it opened in 1995 at the Magic Johnson Theater in Los Angeles. Made a point of seeing it with an audience because that was important to me, that I sort of vote with my box office dollars. There was a line around a city block to see the movie, which played in 6 of the 9 theaters in the multiplex. The manager saw me and let me in, but I still paid my $8 anyway, and sat in the audience with a room full of women who sang along to the soundtrack being piped into the theater and held on to the dog-eared copies of the books. And 3 trailers played before the movie started. The first one was Girl 6. Girl Spike Lee gonna do it again, that's right. The second trailer was Independence Day. Oh, Will Smith gonna save the world. Ooh, I'm going to see that. And the third was Othello, when a woman said, I know Larry Fishburne ain't about to kiss a white woman. This might have mitigated Othello making it to the screen earlier. But many deserving black actors would gladly take the chance of being stoned or popcorned to death at the Magic Johnson theaters. An actor who made a career of elegantly conceived rage was Sidney Poitier, the only black man to work in the 60s. It was a tight-jawed patience that came from knowing he could never be the first person to throw a punch in a movie. Though his favorite role is To Stir With Love, I guess because he plays a man of learning who gets to break down the walls of ignorance and gets through to a bunch of Cockney kids. I've always thought that Poitier was best in the 1957 movie Mark of the Hawk. I don't know how many of you saw it, but he's as slender and stealthy as a blade. He has a suave goatee and mustache. He moves like a dancer. And since he's not shouldering the burden of representing the entire race on the planet, he seems relaxed. He's comfortable with himself. He's playing a specific role. He's not embodying an archetype. And he holds the screen as a young man trying to keep a small African country peaceful, attempting to negotiate a truce between the natives, the angry natives, and the British. This picture could be a metaphor for his career as he tries to preserve his own dignity, as well as act as a go-between between righteous, angry Africans and convince the white Brits of the futility of colonialism. And his own rigid resolve, his need to keep things close to the vest, which is a hallmark of his career, is well used at the heart of the picture, since it's hard to be exactly which side he's on. It is the struggle of the black actor of the 1950s and 60s, staged in dramatic terms, and it's a great movie. Not only was Poitier the first black man to be nominated for and win the Best Actor Oscar, but he was essentially the first black actor to succeed without first scoring as a song and dance performer. Yes, he did star in Porgy and Bess. For one thing, he did not do his own singing, and for another, he was literally on his knees, so he could hardly be termed a triple threat man. But on the other hand, watching these actors, talking to these men, and basically watching Ivan Dixon say he was driven out of the business because during the 70s he could not get work. He took all the money he made on Hogan's Heroes, where he had one line of dialogue every 3 episodes, and used that money to make the spook who sat by the door. His way of thumbing his nose at Hollywood, his way of saying, if you won't help me, I'll help myself. He tried to put the movie together for years, even before there was any kind of distribution or market for it, before the period of black exploitation movies had begun. And he raised the money, went basically from person to person, doing what Robert Townsend would do later in Hollywood Shuffle, and using his own money as a stake. He casted and hired Herbie Hancock to do his first score for the movie, a score that has never been released because no one knows who owns the rights to the movie. And it is a movie that plays political anger as deadpan comedy and was reviewed as if it were a slap in the face of the Constitution. In Detroit, where I grew up, a reviewer, who obviously was basically in the back of the theater ready to run as he saw the movie, said it would be the end of the world as he knew it. I was reminded of that review when I read the reviews of Do the Right Thing, which essentially said that black moviegoers are irresponsible and can't be trusted in the dark. It's almost a pattern that you can see reacted to in a number of movie theaters around the country, this fear of black anger. Many theaters, when black features show, won't turn the house lights all the way down. They want to be able to see what happens in case something breaks out, as a result basically of reactions to New Jack City. But that anger was really what fueled movies in a time when all one had to express was a kind of innocent humility. And the fact that these actors were able to star in a movie like Cabin in the Sky, where they got to show a physical dominance of craft, a bone-deep mastery of skill, it's kind of astonishing, because that is a movie, and I know it's a happy-go-lucky musical about spirituality, but it's a movie that's fueled by anger. It's a movie that basically almost bursts into flames in front of you, especially if you've ever seen it projected. Watching Lena Horne and Ethel Waters compete for screen time and for the same man is a veritable St. Elmo's fire of anger, unleashed as galvanizing song and dance. It's a pinnacle of fury masquerading as a pleasurable entertainment, starring an all-black cast. Wouldn't that be a great quote? What's most intriguing about this lengthy period of black film history, a time that includes hundreds of performances that are incredibly instructive about our own place in this country's history, is that, for the most part, these movies have vanished. They were once a late show staple in the glory days of pre-cable, when local TV stations would run anything that filled time in the cheapest way possible. In those days, those movies were omnipresent. Some might in fact say inescapable. But how could anybody have guessed that soon these roles wouldn't even be visible on TV anymore, because these pictures would all disappear? This occurred to me when Spike Lee's Bamboozled, a well-intentioned but clumsy satire about the dangers of succumbing to the ambitions of celebrity for blacks, was released a couple of years ago. There were a bunch of clips about basically timing performances in Bamboozled, but since none of these pictures featuring black performers struggling to act while being marooned under the spiritual face paint of stereotypes can rarely be seen these days, there's no point of comparison. The movie takes the easy way out, Bamboozled. It doesn't let us know that these people weren't just selling out. It was the only game in town. It wasn't even a game they wanted to play, but it was craps or crap, and that's why they did it. And yet, Bamboozled doesn't bother to sort of present a point for the other side, and I think it shortchanges its own argument in the doing of that, because it's still a great idea for a movie. But nowadays, if you watch AMC or Turner Classic Movies, it's like racism in the movies never took place. The movie is so bent on showing equality that we now get movies like The Wild Wild West, in which Will Smith plays an action hero during the years after Reconstruction. You can make your own joke about that one. I couldn't possibly match what you'd come up with. There is a germ of a very funny idea that just became the stuff of dumb action comedy. And Wild Wild West became so ludicrously anachronistic, I expected Will Smith to answer his cell phone during the picture. And insofar as his way of trying to redefine history, let's not even get into another recent Will Smith period piece, The Legend of Bagger Vance, or Caddying Miss Daisy, as I like to call it. The reinvention of black depiction in the movies has now brought us to the point where slavery is no longer even acknowledged as part of this country's past in the movies. In The Patriot, the Mel Gibson picture about the pre-Revolutionary War skirmishes with the British, African Americans are treated as if they were vacationing on Erykah Badu's farm, swathed in kente cloth, happy with themselves, reading to each other, and regarded with an equanimity that made me wonder why the Civil War was fought in the first place. By doing away with that part of our culture, by pretending black anger didn't exist in the movies, by pretending racism did not exist in the movies, we've eliminated a chapter of cultural history at our peril. Well, drive safely, everybody. I guess we're done.
No way.
Do you feel that, my only knowledge actually of the history of African American film is watching the films and then also reading Thomas Crudup books
Right.
on the history. And I get the same sense that so many of the actors were so angry. I mean, do you know about their personal life inconsistency that they were angry about it? Because some of them were really wealthy, had some homes in LA. I mean, were some of them proud of their accomplishments?
Well, they were proud to be working. I don't think you can honestly say they were proud of their accomplishments. Again, the object lesson being Bilbo Jangles Robinson, who literally lived to fight. And all that sort of stuff he had to sublimate in those movies, he would take. I mean, he had pants custom made with extra deep pockets. I'm not kidding, so he could always have his hand on his razor. He would not take an insult from anybody, and as soon as the shot ended, people ran away from him. And he was not the only one, and then that anger was a real part of what fueled those performances. It really was a code. And if you go back and look at some of those movies, said it here yesterday, quoting Dostoevsky, there is no clean money. But just because you make a living doesn't mean you get to do what you want to do. If you go back over the 35 versions of Othello committed to film, less than a third of them have black actors playing Othello. The darkest they get at one point is having Raul Julia do it, which I guess is still better than having Anthony Hopkins or Laurence Olivier. But the insults in the 1960s, at a time when the Civil Rights Movement was really changing the way America thought about African Americans, at a time when it basically shut down Amos and Andy, when it said these movies cannot be made anymore, that Manton and Moline can't do this, we can't have Willie Best. At a time when that happened, to have somebody, and not just somebody, but have Pauline Kael write that there was no black actor at the time qualified to play Othello, the slap that had to be in every actor's face. And I worked on this the Sidney Poitier AFI Lifetime Achievement Award special, and I met a bunch of these guys, and it was the one thing that just came up out of nowhere. They all brought it up, and they were stunned by it, and it was because they didn't get a chance to sort of state what they wanted to do, be what they wanted to be, to actually play a middle-class black person in a movie that the entire country could see. That anger, that rage was definitely not displaced. It was a part of those performances. It functioned essentially as a kind of underground ambition. No. Morgan Freeman is the angriest black man. You haven't met an angry black man until you met Morgan Freeman. I mean, just think of every time he used the letter A on the electric company as a slash into his soul. He was mopping floors, working as a janitor, sleeping at the place he worked at to get work so he could get a SAG card. Sidney Poitier at least got to work. But again, Morgan Freeman's 10 years younger than Sidney Poitier. Lou Gossett, all these guys couldn't get jobs. There were, like I said, basically two black actors who worked consistently in the movies. And I talked to Brent about that piece because I said, be careful, because I told him that Sidney's a very angry guy. He could never admit to being angry, except now that he's in the 70s and it can't hurt his career anymore. he'll say it. He doesn't really say it in print, but it is undeniable, and is an undeniable part of those performances too. That anger that he had to constantly hold on to. Absolutely. I mean, you talk about making a lot of money. You couldn't be any more furious than Sidney Poitier, and he had to endure the worst of it because his career basically came to an end in 1971 when Shaft came around. And the New York Times took pot shots at Sidney Poitier. Having the New York Times call you on race is like having Ronald McDonald criticize your taste in clothes. And having no avenue in which to respond. And so what Sidney Poitier did was he turned to comedy. He said, I'm finally going to go out and speak to my people. I'm going to be in movies surrounded by other black people. Because in those movies, there was no social milieu that could account for Sidney Poitier, who would walk into a movie, solve a problem, and disappear. So he did Let's Do It Again, A Piece of the Action, and Uptown Saturday Night, to show that he was a real black man, and in his way to attempt to apologize. But even in those performances, he's got this posture that's just kind of, it's kind of anger is rigor mortis. He can't let it go. Even now he can't let it go. You mentioned this. Yes, he's also in Zingo, where he plays, this is actually a great little movie where he plays, it's set in London in 1934. And what's interesting about this movie is that he's basically a dock worker. And you see this movie, and it's basically this sort of, these black and white British dock workers sitting around having drinks in a bar, and it's like there's no race problem. It's kind of astonishing. It's when the movie moves out of that because he's this mythical black king who's been singing this song that's actually the key to his black kingdom, that the picture becomes condescending. When you see him at that bar in Zinga, you want to see a drama about a black man functioning in London as a part of the social fabric. And the movie doesn't offer us that. And Robeson was a man who was basically hounded out of the United States. That's why he made movies in London, because he couldn't get work here. And movies like that were kind of built around him to the extent that they could be. But at some point, he had to take off his shirt and be a tribal king. And that ate at his soul. Well, one easy way to say is that they gave black actors jobs. In 1986, when She's Gotta Have It was released, the last major studio finance movie with a black cast was The Wiz, which basically finished black actor working forever. It was the equivalent of Heaven's Gate. It was one of the biggest money losers in history. And the fact that it was badly directed by a man who had no business making a musical, Sidney Lumet, a guy who made Serpico, it didn't matter. And they basically said, well, black audiences don't want to go to movies anymore. So what Spike Lee said was, first of all, black people want to see black people in movies. Secondly, that white people want to see black people in movies. Thirdly, that they will want to see more of them. But I remember I did a piece on this for Rolling Stone. In February of 1988, they released Shoot to Kill, School Days, and Action Jackson all on the same day in February. As if, hey, you know, happy Black History Month. Go pick one of these movies and good luck to you. And I talked to people involved with all these movies for this piece, and what everybody said was they didn't understand why the studio was essentially offering up this kind of unreal competition. It's as if they were trying to say, well, if these other movies fail, if these movies all fail, in fact, that there's no room for black movies or movies with a black cast. But Spike Lee always found a way to raise money. He always had champions at studios. He was always pretty meticulous about making movies for a certain budget point that made their money back. And School Days is probably one of the most inexpensively produced musicals in studio history. So what he has done is say that there's basically a case for this. One of the things I got at a little bit yesterday was saying that what was perceived to be black anger in those pictures was just posturing. I mean, those were actors who were happy to work and didn't really have a sense of it. Yeah, there's still, and some of those actors do feel some anger, though. I mean, you can't look at, we talked about this yesterday, Denzel Washington, and not know that this guy doesn't feel that he has to work twice as hard to get half as far as any white actor. On the other hand, he's probably better served having his real screen stardom come to him in his 40s, where he can really appreciate it and not burn himself out and sort of use that power. He's interested in doing other things now. He's directed a movie. He can now see in the long term as compared to just becoming a movie star and burning himself out. And he's actually brought people along. He, to the extent that he could, has encouraged Will Smith, although nobody told Will Smith to take Bagger Vance. Nobody. And in fact, he turned down the lead in Bamboozled to play the lead in Bagger Vance. I don't even know what to say about something like that. But there's ambition there. And Spike Lee basically said there's a place for that ambition. To have She's Gotta Have It, and then Hollywood Shuffle will come the next year, movies made by men who cobble together a few $1,000s. She's Gotta Have It cost $13,000 to make. All in, it was about $180,000 in deferred costs. But to shoot it for the 13 days they shot in 3 locations on the streets of Brooklyn with the 16mm cameras was $13,000. And what that said is that you can do it. And it was, to his credit, that's always been one of Spike's mottos, that you can do it. You don't always have to call him, but you can do it anyway. Thank you. Yeah, it seemed to be kind of a one-sided argument a little bit in that. I think, though, one of the things he was what he was trying to get at is basically, the sitcom has become, the black sitcom has become the new Coon Show, has become the new version of Stormy Monday or Mantan Moreland playing Birmingham Brown in the Charlie Chan movies. You know, you see, the kinds of things that were being done on UPN and the WB and Fox. He was trying to comment on that. I just sort of thought that the movie needed to show some deeper history. The point he was trying to make is that there's a bigger world now, that black actors don't have to do that anymore. But I wish he'd gone back to say there was a point when black actors did have to do that, and it grew out of something else, and it became something wholly other and perverted. It becomes a diatribe and not a dialogue. But it's still, I think, a worthy movie and a great subject. The idea of selling out, and he wasn't the first to do it. Robert Downey Sr., rather, forgive me, the other Downey wasn't smoking dope in those days yet. He did a movie called Putney Swope in 1971 about basically pulling a black man out of nowhere and having him sort of turn the idea of selling out on his head by being himself and saying be natural in everything you do. And a series of natural commercials came out of that when this black man became part of an advertising agency. And absolutely, Truth and Soul, very good. Yeah, wasn't that a great movie? Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up Monsters Ball, because when I saw it, it seemed to me to be a movie from the 60s, or rather, a movie, kind of movie Sidney Poitier could have been in. It's the kind of movie in which it seems to be surprising to a black woman living in the South that a white man would call her a nigger. The entire movie is built around this thing that's supposed to be shocking. I mean, it might be ugly, but she certainly wouldn't be surprised to hear it. And it's supposed to make her think differently about herself. It's like a movie made by Visconti in Italy, the 1930s, by somebody who'd never been to the United States before. And that kind of thing still can pass for, you know, genuine motion picture entertainment surprises me. But I think what people are responding to in the movie is Halle Berry's ambition. You know, she's arrived at... Okay. I thought that my ride was here and I was going to have to leave. But I think that rage and resentment is kind of is actually sort of become a different kind of thing now. It's about career. It's about basically turf management. When Angela Bassett attacks Halle Berry for taking off her clothes in the movie and says she turns the picture down, and then the producer says that Angela Bassett was never offered the role, it becomes about a different kind of anger altogether. It's not about anger towards representation or wondering where we have to go from here or basically seizing power. It's anger that's directed more towards, well, where's my job and why did I not win the Oscar but you did? It's a kind of ego and squabbling and pettiness that sort of, I think, undermines the struggle that got them there in the first place. According to the producer, who's also Halle Berry's manager, no, she was never offered the job. There were discussions, and she said she turned it down. And the producer said, how can you turn down something you've never been offered? So in that case, yeah, I turned it down too. I wasn't going to take my clothes off for that night. A huge dialogue between that, obviously. I mean, I only need to say 3 words, Wu-Tang Clan, and that clears it all up, and that basically they're working with Quentin Tarantino right now on Kill Bill. Because there was always such a hunger and interest, I think, in African-American circles to find heroes who weren't white in movies, which is why I brought up Jackie Chan. Those movies basically had a huge underground following. I would sort of trade these really weird, like this microphone weird, videotapes and laser discs that had the most absurd subtitle translations you'd ever see. Like, I'm going to go chew myself a piece of the gum of Mr. Wrigley, and that kind of stuff in these movies. But you actually didn't have to pay attention to the dialogue to know what the movies were about. You knew Jackie Chan was a hero. You knew Jet Li was a hero. You knew Chow Yun-Fat was the hero. You knew who these directors were. And just being able to see action movies that were about cultures other than the predominant white culture succeeding were hugely influential. And in fact, after the blaxploitation cycle ended in most inner city neighborhoods, the Hong Kong cycle took over. And this is for a couple of reasons. First of all, because movies could be booked for next to nothing from little distribution companies, and the single theaters that were most downtowns and inner cities really couldn't afford to spend that kind of money for the big Robert Redford pictures and that kind of stuff, and they could guarantee an audience with these action pictures. There's always been an audience for action pictures. And I was told once by a screenwriter who wanted to do Blade, which is adapt the Marvel comic Blade into a movie in 1982, he was told by a film executive, and I'm not going to give her any names, but this guy is now the editor of Variety. He was told by a film executive that black people don't want to see black people. So, they didn't want to see white people either. So we went to, absolutely, there was definitely, the reason I drew that is because there was always that connection between those movies. And they functioned in that way of sort of keeping the idea of non-white heroes, and more specifically non-white heroes and non-white cultures alive. That's a great question. I'm sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Well, I've always thought that was kind of a false argument. I mean, actresses take their clothes off in movies all the time. It's a way of attacking her for doing that, and that wasn't my quarrel with the picture. I have no problem with Halle Berry taking her clothes off, frankly. I think it's a real artistic expression, and she should do it more often. But no, that's a straw. That's a straw man, you know. In the great movies of the 1970s, there was nudity all the time, and nobody said anything about it then. So it's just a way of saying if a black woman does it, it's not serious. And I think that's the wrong tactic to use to go after somebody. I think I feel maybe a little bit differently about Training Day for a few reasons. One, because it's based on an actual incident and a real LA cop. Two, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, Denzel Washington could not really get an Oscar or serious repute for playing good guys, and he always played good guys the same way he played other people play villains. There's an intensity. They're often not pleasant people, but they're heroes, and he sort of used that. It's kind of a joke here. I mean, in some ways, it's almost like a vaudeville term, and it's him commenting on basically the idea of these charismatic bad black boys who get press all the time. You know, he's almost doing a send-up of movie star behavior, or, you know, hip-hop mogul behavior, as it were, in the picture. He's commenting, using the picture to comment on the perception of black men in the movies. He's not going to make a career of it, and I think he understood, I hope this is answering your question a little bit here too, that there was something bigger than just playing a bad guy, because you can always just sort of twist your mustache and not show a sense of humor in doing it. And I think it was profoundly important to mention King Kong, who was the biggest black movie star of 1935, unfortunately. The original African movie star, if memory serves, even though they shot it in Pasadena, but I guess that makes him African anyway. Yeah, yeah, that's... He give you the mic. Yeah. I think certainly the black audience at the time were able to engage in that kind of unspoken dialogue with those performers, just because they knew the realities of the world. You just go to the movies on a weekly basis and see the kind of paucity of realistic portrayal. And you think back to even the 40s when John Johnson went from house to house in Chicago to put together Ebony and Jet because he wanted to do the black corollaries of life and time, and he wasn't getting that. And to think that he did that and found an audience for that and built these magazines around showing a functioning, thriving black middle class around the country, at the same time you can see no depiction of that in the movies. I think it seemed kind of evident, certainly to my parents and all my parents' friends, from the way they talked about the movies, and at a certain point they just stopped going because it was too painful, because it was too obvious. And as proud as you might be, and you sort of got this in one of your pieces, what got my father into going back to the movies again was seeing Sidney Poitier win the Oscar for Lilies of the Field, which, you know, if they had been surveying black households, you could have started a BET in 1964 based on that moment. And then he went to see Lilies of the Field and promptly stopped going to the movies again because he was reminded of that sort of unspoken contract that black men got to do this, that there was no physical contact. In other fields it got talked about. Certainly Nat King Cole made no secret of it, and Harry Belafonte made no secret of it, and they were actually at one point, I know, going to start a company together. and they were angry about the way black people were depicted in such different ways that they couldn't even get together on it. I think, though, that what was always the real factor in that, the sort of basically ignoring of that sort of semiotic, that dialogue, is just that it didn't appeal to the mainstream. If you go back and read, and I've done a ton of reading of the New York Times, the pitying tone towards black performers in the mainstream press is kind of awe-inspiring. It's like it's being written to children, even the most well-intentioned copy about this stuff, in a way they would never treat jazz musicians who were considered to be intellectuals. Somehow as if there couldn't be a combination of intellect and acting ability in communicating things about drama, the kind of shortchanging and condescension you would never see in theater, written about theater, which turned out to be a way that real inroads were made for black actors in theater. And a number of producers would see these people and eventually give them work. And it's what really changed things. It's so funny, too, when the black action period started, that a number of those actors came from the stage. They were really trained actors. They weren't movie stars. They weren't discovered at Schwab's and signed to a contract and put on a lot of MGM right away. If you were a black performer, you had basically be known. And a lot of these performers, too, in addition to being in movies, also did the live circuit, the Chitlin circuit. They played the houses around the country, so they could, too, express these sort of ambitions and thwarted ambitions and desires more directly to the audiences. For me, it's always been the difference between Sam Cooke live at the Copa and Sam Cooke live at the Harlem Club in Miami. When he plays to two different audiences, and the set at the Copa is really butter smooth. He never breaks a sweat. Hey, cutie, how you doing? Hey, chickie, how are you? And when he plays a set at the Harlem Club, as soon as it starts, you can hear just the noise in the room from the recording is different. There's tumult, there's excitement, and that's, I think, part of what it is too. And this stuff was never really a secret. It just wasn't written about, and that was always been the real horror, and that's what scares me so much about these movies disappearing. When you have a company like, you had Ted Turner buying up all this stuff, all these Warner's movies, and they were the worst of it. But MGM too, because Warner Brothers owned the pre-1950 MGM library, and they basically said, well, we can't run this stuff anymore because it's too embarrassing. It doesn't, just because it's embarrassing doesn't mean it didn't exist, and it didn't do real damage, and we can't hide it away. People like to say that nothing will go away ever again thanks to cable, but that's not true. They're just selective about what they don't want us to remember. Sure, I'm sorry. Sure, do I have any thought on Highly Dreamer's films? I love his work because what he does is offer a sense of social strata in these worlds that he builds. I think he's the closest, you ask about African filmmakers, he's probably the black version of Satyajit Ray without the anti-feminism that you find in Ray's films, because he tends to not like women so much. No woman has to walk behind a man in a Highly Dreamer film, which I like. But it's also about the way it's about functioning sort of, I hate to use the word bourgeois, but functioning working worlds where people have to figure out their relationships to each other based on what they do and who they are rather than what they're not saying in the movies. Oh, yeah. I mean, I mentioned a little bit by talking about Lena Horne and Ethel Waters in Cabin in the Sky. It's very much there in that kind of thing, because in addition to just playing out the dynamics of the plot, they're also fighting for screen time. And, imagine being Ethel Waters. You look like Ethel Barrymore, but you're a lot more down than she is. and you know you could basically, if you're lucky, you'll get one film role a year. That was very much a part of that dynamic for black actresses, and in a weird way, it was worse for them because they were non-threatening, so they didn't have to be depicted as non-threatening. Black men had to be put in their place in the movies. They had to be turned into clowns, and the people presented no kind of sexual or physical threat. And it was basically 10 years after Dorothy Dandridge got the Oscar nomination that the black man finally got one, you know, and before that, you know, there was Gone with the Wind, which has also given a black woman an Oscar nomination too, so, and an award, as a matter of fact, and she barely worked again, you know, so that's why I raised the question for Dorothy Dandridge. Imagine if she had won the Oscar in 1954, what would she have done? Where would she have gone? It might have actually been worse. It might have hastened the awful kind of psychological descent that she had. Wow, I was actually going to talk about a little bit of tomorrow. It's going to be my lecture, What Next? So I can tease you a little bit if you promise to come back tomorrow. It's an awful question because there are, I hate to put it this way, two masters to serve. We want to feel like we're being loyal to the people who are most likely to come see our movies, to most likely to vote with their financial and emotional support of what we do. But at the same time, a lot of these people feel like as artists too, in addition to being Americans, they have a different master they have to salute, they have to try to surprise and to offer some parts of themselves. And art filmmakers, white filmmakers, independent filmmakers get to do that all the time. And you sort of decide that you're not going to go any farther than this, but if you're somebody like Jim Jarmusch, you can always raise a few $1 million to get your movies made because movie stars always want to act, and somebody will always cut his price to be a really interesting independent film. But maybe if you're Halle Berry and it took you this long to get this far, you're not that willing to do it just now. Or if you're Angela Bassett and you're really upset that you didn't win the Oscar 10 years ago and Halle Berry got it instead of you for taking off your top, then what do? This really is, I'm sorry, I don't mean to tease you like that, but this really is a big part of what I was going to talk about tomorrow. And it becomes a question of who these people are making the movies for, and who do they have the luxury of making the movies for. Essentially, if you're making a movie as a black actor, can you be an artist, businessman, or do you have to be a businessman first?